Welcome to Ladies Talking Love, episode 81, Owning Your Flow.
It's Ladies Talking Love, a community of women uncovering more joy and fulfillment in sex as we learn from experts and amazing women like you. Together, let's create a world where women's sexuality is celebrated and understood, beginning with our own. I'm your host, Ariel Finlinson. Let's talk love.
If you have ever had a period or know someone who has, this episode is for you. And yes, I'm saying that everyone should listen to this episode. Even though pretty much every single woman menstruates, we know so little about our menstruation, about our hormone cycles, about the signs that our menstruation is trying to show us. Because as we're going to talk a little bit about in this interview today, your menstrual cycle can actually be a vital sign to show you if there are other things going on in your body that you should look into and recognize. Our menstrual cycles are powerful, and most of us, including myself, haven't even tapped into how important it is to understand our cycles and to lean into the cycles, to use our superpowers during the different phases of our menstrual cycles. Lisa Hendrickson-Jack is a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner who trains women's health practitioners to use their menstrual cycle as a vital sign in their practices. She is the founder of the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program. She is the author of 3 best-selling books, The Fifth Vital Sign, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook, and her most recent book, Real Food for Fertility, which she co-authored with Lily Nichols, RDN. Lisa works tirelessly to debunk the myth that regular ovulation is only important when you want children by recognizing the menstrual cycle is a vital sign. Drawing heavily from the current scientific literature, Lisa presents an evidence-based approach to help women connect to their 5th vital sign by uncovering the connection between the menstrual cycle, fertility, and overall health. With well over 4 million downloads, her podcast, Fertility Friday, is the #1 source for information about fertility awareness and menstrual cycle health. Before jumping in, I just want to let you know that your Black Friday just got a little sweeter. I want to tell you about a gift that you can get for yourself and for your marriage that will keep giving for years to come. Several years ago, this gift would have changed my life. I was like so many of you. I was married to a great, loving guy, but finding that sex wasn't what I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be deeply binding and fulfilling and full of love, but I didn't know how to enjoy it. And I really thought it was more for him anyway. But now I know what it takes to create the type of joyful and connecting sex life that so many of us as women are missing out on. And so I've compiled everything that you need to know from my own experience and also what I discovered in the research during my master's program to help you uncover the joy and fulfillment that you deserve in sex with your husband. So if you're ready to learn to create a deeply connecting sex life, to uncover the pleasure you deserve, to access the desire that you thought you didn't have, and to nurture meaningful patterns of connection with your spouse, this is a fantastic time to invest in my signature course, From Pressure to Passion. From now until December 6th, it will be 30% off. That means that you get almost $100 off of my course and you get lifetime access. This isn't going away. You can go back, you can rework through each of the modules and the guided handouts and use this course to strengthen your marriage for years to come. So if you're ready, go to ladiestalkinglove.com/course and sign up now while the discount lasts. But without further ado, let's talk love. I'm so excited to welcome Lisa Hendrickson-Jack onto Ladies Talking Love. Thanks so much for joining me, Lisa.
Thanks for having me.
This is a topic that I love talking about and want to learn more about myself because I don't know as much as I know I want to know. Menstruation is something that I've experienced for, 25 years, right? We go into changing into womanhood, and so many of us know so little about what to expect, about how to navigate our menstrual cycle so that we can flow with it better and use our powerhouse powers during the different weeks of our cycle. And so I'm so excited for you to teach us today. Can you just start off by telling us a little bit about how you got into this area of expertise?
Well, thank you for having me on. And of course, I love talking about this. I'm still obsessed with this topic after almost 20 years of being in the field. And so, in my case, when I had my very first period, it was painful and heavy. So, kind of primary dysmenorrhea, classic presentation. And I was into sports, did my track and field and my basketball and volleyball and all the things in school. And I also danced ballet. And so, if anyone's danced ballet, you're like in a leotard. So, heavy periods and a leotard,
Yeah.
So girls talk, and I didn't really know much about what to do. So I went to my doctor and asked to be put on the pill because that's what you do. And word on the grapevine was that when you're on the pill, the periods you get are lighter and easier to manage. And so that was my experience. I went on the pill, and I know now that they weren't true menstrual bleeds. They were withdrawal bleeds on the pill, but they were easier to manage. And so, given that I was a child, I thought, okay, I'm fixed. And I came off the pill several times because I wasn't using it for birth control. But every time I would stop taking it, my true periods would come back with a vengeance and be heavy and painful again. So, I didn't have the words to express what was going on with me at the time. But I did know that obviously, whatever the pill was doing was not giving me a true period.
Mm.
So when I actually needed birth control, I kind of did the opposite of what a lot of people do because by that time I had taken the pill kind of intermittently. I had kind of read some of the inserts and I wasn't always taking it at the same time every day and that kind of stuff. So I felt that when I was going to go on the pill for birth control, I was still going to use condoms all the time because I actually didn't trust the thing. And I didn't trust myself to take it at the same time. And I knew I would be stressed about that. And there were also times when I would take two packs one after the other. And so I had this fear that I would get pregnant and not know it because I was taking the pill again and like I wouldn't be alarmed at not having the bleed. All of this was going on in my head. And so I decided to use condoms and I was going to come off the pill and I was going to try to figure out the heavy periods and stuff and see if I could figure it out. So it was right around that time, it was like my first year of university, that I discovered fertility awareness. On my campus, there was a guest speaker from the Women's Center. Her book is named Cunt. And she came to our campus and she read some excerpts of this book. And she read this part of the book where she just somehow, it was kind of like a very artistic book, like poetry, like kind of thing. She just read this excerpt where she talked about how she could figure out when she was fertile or not, paying attention to her mucus and the change in her cervical position and the temperature. And I remember thinking, what do you mean? Tell me more. And so it was that really was the impetus. And I think that I actually went to the Women's Center and I was kind of like, okay, just to put it in perspective, I graduated from high school in the year 2000. So this was like before Facebook, before the internet was the way it is now, and before smartphones and all the things. So physically went to the Women's Center, if I remember correctly, and asked about it. And they told me to get, Tony Weschler's Taking Charge of Your Fertility. So I went to the bookstore and bought it and whatever. And so that was kind of the start. And from there, I started charting like a fish to water. And on my university campus, there was a group of women who were meeting monthly and they were kind of teaching charting and doing some mentorship there. And so, of course, I found myself in that group. And initially I was an attendee, but I very quickly became one of the organizers. And a group of us took a training. So in my early 20s, we had taken this training through Justice and we were teaching and very grassroots in coffee shops, donation recommended. There was no money being made or anything. And so I didn't think I could have this as my career, but obviously I was very passionate about it. And so my personal experience was great. I learned that I could avoid pregnancy effectively by tracking my cycle. And I used that in combination with condoms and I achieved my goal. And then along the way, I also learned that it wasn't just about birth control. There was one point where I was charting, and in those early days of charting, my cycles were not irregular, but they were long. And so my average cycle was about 38 days. And so this was how it was going. And one of my charting instructors, she looked at my chart and she was kind of like, well, Lisa, your temperatures are too low and your cycles are too long. Think you should get your thyroid checked out. Even that moment really changed how I looked at it because I'm thinking to myself, like, how did you look at my cycle and tell me that you think I could have some kind of issue? And so in those early days that I really started to understand the connection between menstrual cycle health and overall health, that's essentially the beginning. And then fast forward 10 years of having this knowledge. And when I was having my first son, that's kind of when I realized I had been able to take this knowledge for granted all these years. Throughout my entire 20s, I was able to use fertility awareness to avoid pregnancy when I wasn't trying to get pregnant. And then when I was ready to conceive, when my husband and I wanted to try for a baby, I was just able to kind of switch up the days and I was able to take all of that for granted. And I kind of looked around and so many women were struggling to conceive and the world hadn't changed. The average woman still had no idea about her cycle.
Yeah.
And so it was around that time that I decided to put out my podcast to kind of see if anybody was interested in what I had to say. I knew that information had really made a difference for me. And so the response was pretty incredible. And that's kind of where it all began. Out of that, I wrote my first book, The Fifth Vital Sign. And that was my way of, because whenever women learn about cycle charting, of course, it's like, everyone should know this. Like, it's kind of like you're excited and then you're immediately pissed off.
Right? How has no one told me this?
I know. Because I get messages from people of all the stages. So some women are lucky to find it like I did really young, but others are finding this out at like 40. And it's like, oh my gosh, how am I 40 and I didn't know this? And so I wrote the book as my way of saying, okay, here's what you need to know. This is in a nutshell, the things. And then also not just about the charting piece, but about the connection to health so that we can start looking at our menstrual cycle as a vital sign. Because there is an argument to be made that we should be looking at it that way. Because much like the other vital signs that we're used to, like our heart rate or our temperature, our menstrual cycle in real time changes depending on what's happening. Like if your length is too long, if you're not ovulating, if you have spotting when you're outside of your period, that kind of stuff, it can really shed some light onto what could be happening at a deeper level for our health. So in a nutshell.
Oh, I love that so much. So let's dive in a little bit. You talked about charting. You also talked about how when we chart, we can recognize some of the areas that our body might be saying like, hey, something's going on here. Can you define what charting is for everybody listening? And then maybe talk about just what are some of the things you might find as you start to chart your menstrual cycle?
So when I use the words charting, it just refers to the kind of process of tracking the main signs that we would pay attention to. So it kind of falls under the umbrella of fertility awareness. It's simply having an understanding of your menstrual cycle. And when you can kind of just do it in a general sense, you can think of it just having an understanding of when your days are your fertile days, how do you tell when ovulation is, and that kind of stuff. But for women like myself who want to use it for a practical purpose, I think the most common reasons that women are charting their cycles more specifically and intentionally is either to try to get pregnant or to avoid pregnancy. And in some cases, women are tracking for general health just to get a better sense of what's going on. So the three main signs that most fertility awareness-based methods might use, or I guess I should say symptothermal methods, the three main signs that are used the most in symptothermal methods would be your cervical mucus. Those are simply an excretion from your cervix. So your cervix is, I don't want to say it wrong, but the cervix is where the baby comes out. So the base of the uterus is what I was trying to say, in case anyone isn't familiar. And so that is where the cervical fluid is released. It can look like creamy white hand lotion. It can look like clear, stretchy, raw egg whites. And what's interesting is that when I was young, and I think for many women, you have no idea what's going on. No one told you.
You're like, what is this? What is this
Yeah.
in my underwear?
Yeah. I can remember getting to that age and then just going to my mom and being like, Mom, my underwear is wet all the time. And she was like, okay, just wear a panty liner. And that was the conversation because she didn't know. Some women actually think that it's an infection, like a recurring one. And they go to the doctor and can you imagine, like there's women who've been like put on antibiotics because they're ovulating and they didn't know about the mucus. So anyway, so that's one of the main signs that you can pay attention to. And what's helpful to know is that it is a normal sign of fertility. And it's something that if we were educated about, I think it would help any negative feelings that we might have about our vulva.
Right.
Because it can be around that time of the cycle as well. Your cervical fluid is flowing. You tend to have more of a pronounced scent, if you will. Not in a bad way, because as long as you're healthy, it's not like a fishy scent or anything like that, but it's just more pronounced of your natural scent. And I've had many conversations with clients over the years where they are like really uncomfortable with that. And so I think it's helpful even from a young age to just be aware, like this is actually a normal bodily function. It means that your hormones are you're producing hormones, your ovarian hormones are stimulating the production of this cervical fluid, and it helps you to identify the days that you're fertile. It helps you to identify also when ovulation is happening. So anyways, that's the first sign of fertility. And then basal body temperature. So that's when you take your temperature, first thing in the morning before you get out of bed. And then cervical position is an optional sign that many women may track. And so that's when you actually insert your finger into your vagina and kind of identify the difference in the position and texture of your cervix. What's really interesting, if someone's hearing this information for the first time, it can sound kind of wild. A lot of people are familiar with the rhythm method, and they're not even familiar with it. They've just like heard the words. So the rhythm method is based on calendar tracking. So it's not based on the biomarkers that I just talked about. It's based on having a sense of how long your cycle is and assuming ovulation is happening around day 14 and kind of trying to gauge your behavior based on this previous cycle or averages or whatever. Whereas modern fertility awareness based methods are based on your actual biomarkers. And there's a lot of science behind it. I think it can be shocking to someone who's hearing this for the first time to learn that there's a whole science behind this. So, at the most basic level, when you are having your menstrual cycle, the first day of your cycle represents the first day of your period, the first day of your true bleed or your true flow. And as you move through your cycle, the first half of the cycle, that's what we call our pre-ovulatory phase. What's happening in that phase is essentially your ovaries are preparing for ovulation. So at the beginning of the cycle, you have a group of follicles that are developing, and as they develop and grow, one of them is chosen to ovulate. And while that is happening, they are releasing significant amounts of estrogen. And the follicle that goes on to ovulate grows to 20 times its size, and it really puts out a significant amount of estrogen. And it works as a feedback loop. So once your estrogen rises to a certain point, that triggers the release of a hormone, LH, luteinizing hormone, which is what the ovulation strips test for. And then within 24 to 36 hours or so, as long as everything's going the way it's supposed to go, then ovulation will happen. And so that estrogen that you're making in that first half of the cycle, it does a lot of things. And one of the things it does is it stimulates the cervical crypts to make mucus. So when we're talking about these things, again, it's science, it's biology, it's really fascinating stuff. And because of that, your cycles are not going to be exactly the same every single time, but you do get a sense of what I like to call your patterns. If you have your period, maybe your period lasts 4 to 5 days. Like maybe your period in particular kind of follows a certain flow. And the more you track it, the more you kind of get used to like what your periods are like. And then maybe after your period, you have a few days, what we call dry days, before you start to see your mucus. And then maybe you see like a few days of mucus. And so you can start to track to see what's normal for you. Once you ovulate, your ovary obviously releases the egg, and that triggers a change in what's happening hormonally. So after ovulation is when we make our progesterone. We don't really make significant progesterone until after we ovulate. So once you ovulate and you start making that progesterone shuts down the mucus. So you had all this mucus leading up to ovulation, and now we have dry days in a normal, typical, healthy cycle for the most part. And progesterone does other things as well. The interplay of estrogen and progesterone is what builds up our uterine lining and prepares for pregnancy and all these different things. And the release of progesterone also is what causes the rise in basal body temperature that we can measure when we're doing it. So the progesterone has a thermogenic effect. So what really got me interested in this when I was the tender age of like 17, 18, coming out of high school, was that I could track it.
Yeah.
It was so great for my nerdy, sciencey mind that I could track what was going on. I could take my temperature. I could feel the change in my cervix. I could see the change in my mucus. And it kept happening cycle after cycle. So it became a constant. And I felt very confident in these changes in my body. I wasn't guessing. It wasn't based on a calendar. I didn't feel unsure of what was going on. And it's kind of like for the first time I understood what's happening in my cycle. Because in school, they just said, oh, you get pregnant every day and you get pregnant. There's no safe days. But they don't tell you why.
Yeah.
The threat of pregnancy. Like you're just sitting there ducking in your house. Like, can I get pregnant now? What about now? Like no one's telling you anything. But like when you learn about fertility awareness and you actually start to track your cycle, it's like, oh my gosh, no more mystery.
Yeah.
Like, I get what's going on. And then the other thing too is it freed me. I didn't have to feel like I needed to rely on contraceptives. I was
Yeah.
able to figure this out and learn about my body and all that great stuff.
It's so empowering. And I'm definitely planning to have you on to dig more into like how to track for fertility and look at all the signs. And today I wanted to focus a little bit on the different phases of our menstrual cycles. And you just came out with a book talking about food to support our healthy menstrual cycle. So I'd love to go through what are some of the different phases of our menstrual cycle that we experience.
So I kind of outlined it very generally. So you can divide it into the menstrual phase, which would be the time of menstruation, and the follicular phase, which is the literal development of the follicles, which falls into the preovulatory phase of the cycle. So we can take the cycle actually and divide it in half. We could look at the preovulatory phase and the post-ovulatory phase. And then within that preovulatory, we have the menstrual and the follicular. And then after that, we have the luteal. Once you ovulate the former follicle, it becomes the corpus luteum. The word is Latin for yellow body, because if you were to open the abdomen and look inside and look at the ovary, you would see this kind of yellow scar looking thing on the ovary after ovulation. So we have our follicular and luteal phases. As I mentioned, in that follicular phase, estrogen is the dominant hormone during that time because that's really what is being produced as that follicle is preparing for ovulation. And as I mentioned, estrogen has the impact that it does on cervical mucus. It also causes the uterine lining to build and develop. So during that time, when you have your period, it's kind of like the functional layer of your uterine lining is shed, as we know. Then you're kind of left, like it's not a blank slate, but we can go with that analogy. And so it's the estrogen that stimulates the endometrial lining to build back up during that first half of the cycle. As I mentioned as well, it works like a thermostat, I think is a good example of how ovulation takes place, because similar to a thermostat in your house, like when the temperature gets too high, the thermostat shuts off. And so once the estrogen is reaching a certain threshold, that is what sends the message back to the pituitary that it's time to ovulate. And then that's what causes the release of the luteinizing hormone. And one of the best analogies that I've heard about the luteinizing hormone surge is imagine your ovary, or you could say the follicle, maybe the follicle is better, as a balloon. And then the LH is the pin. And so, boop. And that's, I think, a great way to kind of remember what's going on for anyone who's hearing all these, I'm throwing out all these terms, all these hormones and all this stuff. But yeah, like it's really interesting. And I think in that, there's a lot of information. A lot of the conversation around menstrual cycles is around hormones and hormone imbalances and what could be happening. And many women don't realize that we make our hormones, those main hormones that determine what's happening in our menstrual cycle, are estrogen and progesterone. We produce them in the ovaries. It's really the follicle that is making the estrogen, and then the corpus luteum, which is essentially, similar, came out of the same follicle, but the corpus luteum is producing the progesterone. So all of this hormone production, at least for these hormones, is happening in the ovary itself. And then once you ovulate, so we could call that phase around ovulation your ovulatory phase if you want, but ovulation happens on one day of the cycle. And if the egg is not fertilized, it disintegrates within about 12 to 24 hours. And so once you ovulate, then you move into that luteal phase. In the fifth vital sign, I spoke about this concept of the seasons of the menstrual cycle. There's an amazing book called Wild Power by Alexandra Pope and Shawnee Hugo Wurlitzer. Are you familiar with their work at all?
Mm-mm.
So
You'll have
I'm a
to
big
send me
fan.
the link. I'll put it in the show notes.
For sure. So the reason I share that is because they beautifully talk about this concept of the seasons of the menstrual cycle, which is really helpful, especially when I tend to be cerebral. And so I'm like in the weeds with the research and the science. And so it's helpful to balance that out also with what's happening on an energetic level and
Yeah.
like an emotional level and things like that. So we can think of our menstruation as that inner winter. And if anyone has experienced menstruation, I don't really need to explain much more. Like you kind of know what that means. If you think about winter, everything, like I live in Canada, so winter, like the leaves are off the trees, everything's bare, it's cold.
You're ready to snuggle up and drink hot
Yeah,
cocoa.
exactly. You're ready to like restore and
Hibernate.
just kind of hibernate. Exactly, exactly. And so that would be the menstrual phase. The follicular phase, well, that's like the spring. What's happening in the follicular phase? I often use an analogy of the follicle developing as if it's a tree, and instead of the follicle isn't the tree, but I always picture a mango tree because I like mangoes, but you can picture whatever tree you want. But when you have a mango tree, mangoes are like small and green. That's kind of like that early follicular phase. And then really as the sun comes out and everything ripens, that's like what happens in the ovulatory phase. So spring is a perfect analogy for what's happening in our follicular phase because we're starting to have those buds, those developments, and everything's kind of energy's coming back. We have that coming out of winter, you're starting to feel like yourself again, all that great stuff. So that's a really good analogy for that kind of follicular phase. And then once you're in the thick of it, estrogen levels are the highest right around ovulation, then that would be your summer. A lot of women find that it's during those phases, the follicular and the kind of ovulatory phase, that they have a lot of energy. They feel more outgoing. Of course, everyone isn't the same.
Yeah.
So everyone doesn't resonate in the exact same way, but it is kind of a general thing that a lot of women do find that they resonate with that. Now, if your hormones aren't that balanced or you have potentially issues with excess histamine production, some women may not feel as awesome around ovulation, but a lot of us feel awesome. And then once you've ovulated, then we move into that fall. So that would be that early luteal phase, kind of like that first week after ovulation, when we're still doing pretty good, but we're kind of winding down. And then I would say that week before your period, that would be the true autumn. That's when we really get into that phase where we start wanting to hibernate again. One of the things I found really interesting, because I've been in this field for quite some time, is that within the last several years, more and more women have been talking about the concept of cycle syncing, and you can orient whatever you want to your cycle. So whether that's exercise, whether that's even your work schedule, how you take appointments, what you want to do with your family, whether you want to do certain types of activities at one time or another. So I find it all very interesting, but there is some truth to that. Once you learn about the different phases of your cycle, not only from a biological standpoint, but pay attention to how you feel energetically, it can be really helpful because we live in a world where we are on a circadian cycle, 24-hour cycle, like all the men.
Yep.
Except we are on, as Elisa Vitti calls it, an infradian cycle, which is like not every 24 hours, it's like a monthly. And so with that said, I think a lot of us need permission to operate differently.
Yeah.
So whether that's maybe we schedule more meetings, more calls, more interviews around our follicular and ovulatory when we have more energy, and allow ourselves to schedule less around our winter.
Yeah.
I've even had clients who I have to give them permission not to work out when they're bleeding because they're just, no, I'm doing a 40-day challenge. You can actually just not run on day one of your period. Like you could just not.
Yeah.
And that would be okay. You could run even harder when you feel better in the middle of your cycle. That was a whole lot of information there, but there's so much you can say about the phases of the cycle, right?
Yeah. And I think it's so empowering as people start to look at how they're feeling and tracking their cycle. Oh, I do feel more tired. And I've recognized over the past couple of years as I've tried to be more in tune with what I'm feeling throughout my cycle, like while I'm bleeding, I usually need a nap.
Yeah.
I am just so exhausted during that time. And so I try to slow down. Sometimes I even talk to my husband like, hey, I'm going to be on my period in the next couple of days. So I'm going to need some extra support in these certain areas that maybe I carry more of during my summer and springtime. And so I think it's so helpful, like planning trips, planning like launches or work projects, just kind of looking at your cycle. I wish someone had talked to me about this before I got married, because I got married and started my period like 2 days after I got married. I'm like,
Oh,
why did
man.
no one ever tell me to like pick a date based on my cycle? And I just think it can be so helpful. What are some tips? You gave a couple, but that you would give women as they're starting to track how they feel to shift things up and work with their cycle instead of, like you said, basically the whole world works on men's cycle, a 24-hour period of hormone turnover. And so we have to be really intentional if we're going to choose to work on our more, I've heard people compare it to like, right, the moon cycle.
Yes.
What are some tips to help that you have found helpful for women to start to tune in and really plan things around their cycle?
The first thing that I'll say is that you can kind of take it as far as you want. I wouldn't want to encourage it to become like an obsession where it's like if you have a meeting on your period, you fail. Like, no, we don't need to go all the way down there. So I think one of the first things you could do is just track your period. It's amazing how many apps there are now. It's exciting to see because so many women are discovering charting through so many different means. And so the simplest thing you could do, I think, is just to start tracking your periods. And many women do that already. Many women are already kind of putting it on their calendar, putting a little X on their calendar, doing their thing. So that would be kind of like the first step. And I think learning about cervical fluid can be really helpful because many of us weren't taught about it.
Yeah.
If you're not currently on hormonal contraceptives, that is one of the easy ways to start being in tune with what's happening hormonally and what part of the cycle that you're in. And so just a little bit about cervical mucus. We talked a little bit about it, clear, stretchy, and lotiony type. But cervical mucus is kind of the key to fertility. When you're producing cervical mucus in your cycle, especially when we're talking pre-ovulatory, that coincides with when your cervix is open. Those are your fertile days. So when you're observing the cervical fluid, and let's say you've had your period and then you start noticing several days after your period that you see this mucus, that coincides with your fertile window. So those are the days where if you were to have unprotected sex, pregnancy could happen. And then once it goes away, then provided that you're confirming ovulation, the method that I'm teaching, we confirm with temperature and with mucus. But once the mucus goes away, your temperature has gone up, that means you have ovulated and you're kind of entering into that autumn phase, if you will. And so just having that basic knowledge about your cervical fluid and what it means, knowing that it has a relationship to when you're fertile in your cycle, knowing that it helps you to confirm ovulation, that is really helpful as well. One of the most basic things that learning about your cycle and all this can do for you is to predict when your period is coming.
Yeah.
So that's something very practical. Let's say that all you do is look at your mucus. You start to identify that some of those days you have lots of mucus, it's flowing, your underwear is wet, and then it goes away. If you start paying attention to that and you count the number of days between when the mucus stopped and when you have your period, you can start to predict your period length. And so a healthy luteal phase, second half of the cycle, tends to be about 12 to 14 days long. And the luteal phase tends to be a bit more stable than the follicular phase. So the follicular, like before you ovulate, ovulation can be delayed by stress or a variety of other factors. And so the cycle length can be a bit different, but the luteal phase overall, it tends to be a little bit more stable. So that's something I think just as that beginning of like, how can we start acquainting ourselves with our cycle? How can we start tracking? How can we start paying attention? I would say track your period and like pay attention to mucus. That would be your kind of in.
Yeah.
And then in terms of organizing your schedule and everything, I think start to just pay attention. However that looks for you, you could just pay attention, but often if we don't write stuff down, we kind of forget about it. So if you have a little journal or if you want to use an app, then that's helpful as well. There's all these emojis, but there's also a little comment section. So you can start making a note of which days you have energy. So I have clients who track all kinds of stuff because I don't necessarily tell them to track everything under the sun, but I've seen clients track all kinds of things. So you can, for example, put an energy. So I'm thinking of these apps that are really customizable that allow you to put all these different custom categories. So for example, you could put in energy and you could have a score. You make it up like 3, 2, 1 or 1 to 4. And you can literally put 4, 4, 2, 1 or whatever is going on. You can track your sleep. You can track what you're eating. You could track how much you work out. And you can start to see if you're tracking your cycle. You could track your stress 1 to 4 or whatever, like angry emoji, happy emoji, all those things. And you can start to see after a few cycles of tracking, you start to see how these different factors can really affect you.
Yeah.
And you can start to see how you feel. Like if you're really into exercise and working out, maybe you're paying attention even to your recovery time, or you might notice that you have better results at certain times of your cycle. Like if you really want to get into cycle hacking and like go hard, you really could if you wanted to. You just have to track whatever you want to pay attention to and see if it changes where you are in the cycle. And I think you could just even basically just track your energy, how tired you feel, how engaged you feel maybe. And then once you start to get a sense of where you're at, know that it is valid and relevant. And then know that you have the power to, if you do, assuming that you have the ability to change your schedule and make some decisions there, then I give you permission to change things up. I think as women, we sometimes need someone to give us permission. But I was speaking to a client the other day. We've recorded a podcast. She's wonderful. And it was a great conversation. And she works in tech. So her job is kind of like meetings, all kinds of stuff's going on. And she said, and I think she does some sales because she said that she noticed that she had better results for her sales calls and everything when she did them in line with her cycle. So she changed around her schedule and she's like, no one even really noticed, but my output increased and everything. But she said, I realized that I have a better output. My sales calls were going better. I was having better results. So I switched my schedule around so that she kind of organized it with her cycle so that she does more wrap up work and more cerebral things that maybe don't require that front facing energy in the luteal. And she said that she really upped her productivity. So I think depending on what you do and what would make sense for you, you can totally go hard. And then on the flip side, you don't have to be that intense about it. Maybe all you do is get some help from your husband
Yeah.
instead of feeling like you need to do everything.
Right.
And that's amazing. Hey.
And I was going to say too, like sometimes there are things we can't change. Like our kids have a soccer game, right? It's like,
Yeah.
I got to reschedule this. I can't leave that, but just like
Yeah.
giving yourself, I've just found it really helpful to like give myself grace to know during my winter phase, the luteal, and when I'm bleeding, to recognize like I'm usually more tired. I talk to my kids about it and I give myself grace because my emotions do come up and I get more emotional and I start to question every decision I've ever made in my life. And I know, do not make a really important decision during this phase because I'm not thinking as clearly. And so just those things have been helpful for me, even if I can't change everything. Just give myself grace and recognize it. These are real, but also it's okay and let it
Yeah.
flow. I would love to hear, because there are a lot of really hard things that can happen during your menstrual cycle as well, especially during the bleeding phase, right? You might have cramps, or right before you start to bleed, you might have PMS. Can you talk a little bit about what those are caused from and maybe some things women can do to actually help manage those?
Yeah, for sure. PMS, what's really interesting about PMS is that it is correlated with having low estrogen as you are in that phase of your cycles. When you look at the research on PMS, women who suffer from moderate to severe PMS tend to have more of a significant imbalance of estrogen and progesterone, but more specifically being like the progesterone drops too soon.
Mm.
So in a healthy menstrual cycle, if you were to look at like a hormone chart, like we've all kind of seen these hormone charts. Well, many of us have seen these hormone charts where you have like estrogen. I'm drawing it with my finger and none of the listeners can hear. But you have the estrogen in the first half and it's like a soft curve up. And then the second half of the cycle, you have your progesterone and it's like another little hill. So you got these two little hills, if you will. The estrogen doesn't just drop after ovulation. It kind of continues to be pretty moderate. So it's not to say estrogen drops off. So if you picture, this chart, when a woman has PMS, instead of it being like a nice hill with like a soft arches up and then gradually is the key word, lowers before your next period, assuming that you were not pregnant, what can happen is different things, different factors can result in having a sharp drop off or even just never getting as high as it needs to and just being too low. So when you have too little progesterone in relation to estrogen, that is what is kind of correlated with some of these factors. So PMS is a really interesting topic. When I was writing about it in my first book, I was reading all these studies and it was like 90% of women to have, complain about PMS or experience PMS. And it's like, well, if 90% of women who ran a marathon were tired after, at some point we'd have to be like, well, so we can break PMS into a bit of a different category from that respect. One of the things that I spoke about in that chapter of the book was this concept of menstrual melamina. And it's this old medical term that kind of refers to just a category of symptoms. So you can think of it as like mild PMS. So in line with this analogy of the menstrual cycle, like the seasons of the cycle, if you have menstruated, if you've had this experience, you can attest to the fact that our energy does change around that time. And so I think the key is to identify the difference between like a normal change where you have maybe some mild symptoms where it's not having a negative effect on your day or your activities, but maybe you just notice that you are a little bit more tired and you are a little bit less open to disagreement or whatever it is. I've often had this picture in my mind. It's like you have this inner secretary. What I find now, everyone's experience can be different, but it's not like when I am approaching my period, I'm upset that the sky is blue. It's not like it's random, like my shirt is red. I'm so mad. It's usually actual things that actually bother us, but that we kind of just don't talk about. You know what I mean? Like the stuff that we kind of put up with It's like not bad enough for me to talk about it on Thursday, but like I'm still kind of irritated. So I think of it like you have a secretary inside that's like throwing stuff on your desk once a month and it's like, are you gonna deal with this time? So I actually think that it's a useful process. And I think that when we are hormonally healthy, when we are nourished, when we're getting sufficient protein, when we're having sufficient fat so that we can build our hormone stores and everything, and things are working out, it should be relatively mild, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't have any symptoms at all
Yeah.
because we are cyclical
Yes.
humans. So when we venture into the realm of like moderate to severe symptoms or even extreme, then that's
Can you maybe say like what that would look like?
yeah, there are 4 categories of PMS that I talked about in the book, and one of them is anxiety, one of them is carb cravings, hyperhydration and bloating, and depression. So I think that when you get to the stage where it's actually having a negative impact on you in one way or another, and it's kind of extreme, like you're crying 1 minute and like, like it's hard for you to cope with.
Yeah.
No one wants to be around you. So I feel like if we talk about it in the way that I've just presented it, I think most of us could kind of think in terms of the difference between what would be a very mild experience versus people call it
Yeah.
Dragon Week, right?
Right.
And then the extreme PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, would be when it legit you can't go to work for a couple
Yeah.
days and it's actually having a negative impact to the point that it's disrupting your daily affairs. So we can see that it's on a continuum. In my latest book, Real Food for Fertility, I teamed up with Lily Nichols, who's registered dietitian nutritionist. This is her 3rd book. She previously wrote Real Food for Pregnancy and Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. And so essentially what we're talking about is baseline nutrition that is necessary for optimal cycling
Yeah.
and also the lifestyle factors and everything that contribute to it. So a lot of women who struggle with PMS, like when I'm working with clients, I can take my clients through what I call the foundational factors, which is kind of like a step-by-step approach to determine what could be causing these hormonal imbalances. So for example, if you are a shift worker and you barely get more than 4 hours of sleep, well, that's a good recipe for low progesterone. You actually need sleep in the dark to produce sufficient melatonin, and that supports our ability to produce progesterone. If you drink coffee 3 times a day and fast and skip meals, and then overall you're not eating enough calories for a human woman, that is associated with low progesterone. If you work out a lot, don't eat enough, huge for low progesterone. So these are just a couple of examples. There are things within our control that we can do. And often women who are struggling with PMS, often it's something related to whether it's their diet, habits, lifestyle is not leading to optimal hormone production and things like that. So there's a lot within our control. Like
Yeah.
the good news is that there's actually a lot within our control. And most of the clients I've worked with, we're able to identify something. And then if it's not something lifestyle, we can look at if there's some sort of health related issue or
Yeah.
something
And
like
what
that.
have you found with cramps or other things you see? Are those able to be helped with lifestyle and food as well?
Yeah. When I was looking into the research about menstrual cramps, I think one of the first things that I wanted to do is research what is happening when a woman has her period. And so, what a period is, it's a normal inflammatory process by which our lining is shed. And during that process, we are producing prostaglandins and other kind of inflammatory factors to cause smooth muscle contractions that result in the shedding of the lining. And the lining itself, the tissue itself is kind of like degrading. And so what's interesting is when you look at research that compares the prostaglandin levels, which is a marker of inflammation, of women who have pain versus women who do not, the women who report pain in their period have upwards of 4 times the levels of prostaglandins. That would indicate that it's a normal inflammatory process that has kind of gone awry.
Mm.
So one of the things that can be really helpful is to start to understand a little bit more about how the body's working and understand what potential sources of inflammation are. There's kind of 2 approaches. One would be to remove the potential foods or other factors that are triggering additional inflammation. And then another approach would also be to consume foods or nutrients that are known to reduce inflammation. I've supported a number of clients to improve their painful symptoms. It's amazing what can be done when you start to identify the sources of inflammation.
Yeah.
So I'm not anti-dairy. I'm actually a big dairy fan, but one of the common sources of inflammation would be the commercial A1 dairy. the feedlot cows that eat grain, like cows are supposed to eat grass. So we have an issue with the quality of our food in our respective countries. That's one thing where if you're consuming the regular dairy that's eating the inflammatory grains and that kind of thing, there's studies that show that when cows eat grains, the meat and milk that they produce have higher levels of omega-6 fatty acids that are inflammatory. So I could go on about this for a while, but just the type of dairy. So there's protein in the milk that can cause a lot of problems. A1 beta casein is what it's called. And so typically the milk you buy at the grocery store comes from the Holstein cows, and they tend to produce milk with this A1 protein. And if you've ever had a friend whose child can't drink regular milk, but they can drink sheep's milk or goat's milk. So because sheep and goat's milk tend to have a different protein, the A2 beta casein. So some women can switch from the A1 dairy to an A2 dairy option, like sheep's milk or goat's milk, or if they find cow's milk that has A2 dairy, switch from the like feedlot cows to the grass-fed, and they're not as inflammatory and etc. And maybe going towards a less processed version, a more toward natural version of this. So that's one thing that's huge for women. So many women just literally switch up the dairy and see an improvement in their pain. And then there's a variety of food sensitivities and different things, and highly refined carbohydrates, processed foods. This is none of the things I'm saying are a surprise to anybody. Like if you eat a lot of sugar and if you eat a lot of refined carbohydrates, I mean, that's a source of inflammation right there. So if you kind of look at what you're eating, that's why the book is titled Real Food for Fertility. So we're arguing for a diet toward real food, and how we define is essentially food that you know what it is. If I take white sugar out of my cabinet and I put it in a cup or something, I don't know whether it came from a beet or sugar cane or like a carrot or corn. Like who knows where it came from, because it's so highly processed that we don't even know where it came from, right? But if I look at a banana, obviously I know what that is. And so you can think of that as a good guideline. Like you know where it is and where it came from. It's more likely real food. If you don't even know where those ingredients could possibly have been derived from, it's more heavily processed. That's something to consider. And then incorporating foods that are known to be anti-inflammatory. So whether it's eating fish, whether it's incorporating certain supplements. Many of my clients have seen improvements with their period pain just by taking some magnesium, and magnesium also helps with sleep, by taking zinc or consuming zinc-rich foods like oysters, and actually, interestingly, beef is one of the best sources of zinc, or the most common, I should say, sources of zinc. So there's a lot of things that you can do. And one thing I'll say though about period pain is what I've experienced is that many women experience period pain that they would rate between like a 4 and a 6, or a 4 and a 7 on the pain scale. So if you imagine 0 being no pain and 10 being like really bad. So for many women, those changes may be sufficient to reduce or eliminate their pain. I have worked with a certain percentage of women whose pain is so extreme, that's like 9 or 10 on the scale, that is highly suspicious of endometriosis, also accompanied by a variety of gut-related issues, food sensitivities. Maybe the pain is in a very specific location. Maybe they're also having pain with intercourse or pain at other times, not just pain on their period, but maybe they have like pain a week before their period as well. So we do also want to be aware of the connection between like chronic pelvic pain and endometriosis. And I have had many, I would say the majority of my clients do see significant relief with the changes I just talked about in a more focused way.
Yeah.
But there's a percentage of women for whom they may need more than that, especially if it's indicative of a more chronic underlying issue. And this is, again, going back to the idea of the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. If we think of the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, then when we have a normal menstrual cycle falling into normal parameters, periods are not painful, the general overall length of a cycle that we would consider to be normal,
Not disrupting life.
yes, all those things, that would be the sign of health. And we should look at extreme PMS or extreme pain or irregular or abnormal menstruation or abnormal bleeding throughout the cycle or whatever it is. We should look at that as a sign that we should be looking deeper.
Yeah. Oh, this has been so good, Lisa. I have learned so much. Thank you for coming on. We'll make sure and link your books in the show notes so people can check those out, because just when you're talking about PMS, it's such an ingrained thing in at least the culture of where I've lived, right? Where it's like, oh, PMS, like it's thrown out whenever a woman,
Yeah. Oh, it's that time of the
right?
month.
Oh,
Oh,
must
don't
be.
go
And
next to Tina.
right? And it's like, okay, hold up. So I love that
First of all, we need to pull that back and be like, people can have emotions, whether they're a woman or a man, whether or not they're on their menstrual cycle, and that there are things we can do to assist that. And if you're recognizing like, wow, this is really extreme, maybe we do need to see if it's like endometriosis or maybe PCOS. Would that be another one that would cause pain?
Well, so I think that's a common myth. Common traits of PCOS, like the Rotterdam criteria that they look at to diagnose it. It's when women have long or irregular cycles,
but not necessarily painful.
not necessarily
okay?
Painful. The cycles are long, irregular. They may or may not have cysts on the ovaries. And many of the women with PCOS also have elevated androgens. It's interesting because it's very common. A lot of women think that pain is associated with PCOS, but those two things are completely separate. I've had many clients that don't have period pain, but they have PCOS. So it's like two separate factors.
I'm glad you clarified that because I was like, I don't know. I'm just throwing this out. This has been so good. I'm excited. I definitely want to have you back on because there's so much you can teach us. What advice would you give to women who are wanting to understand and appreciate their menstrual cycles more? Where would you tell them to start?
Great question. I wrote 2 books, so I can also do the shameless plug of like,
you should.
Well, there's lots of different resources available. Obviously, as I had mentioned earlier, my first foray into menstrual cycle charting and fertility awareness specifically was Tony Weschler's Taking Charge of Your Fertility. So for anybody who really enjoyed the conversation that we had today, you can jump into my rabbit hole. I have a podcast, Fertility Friday. I'm in my 10th year of podcasting. Like we have over 500 episodes, which is completely
That's amazing.
If you type Fertility Friday in your podcast player, you will find some episodes to tune into there. The recent book that I just released, so we released this book on Valentine's Day. That was my co-author's idea. So we're still like in the thick of it. We're really excited about the book, Real Food for Fertility. So if you want more information about that book, we really wrote that book obviously for women who are trying to conceive. Like obviously the book is called Real Food for Fertility. But for me, it was the book that I felt all of my clients needed because I would work with a lot of clients who were not actively trying to conceive right now. And for these clients, they still want to have hormone health. They still want to have healthy cycles. They still want to have pain-free periods and they don't want to have PMS. And so Real Food for Fertility provides those nutritional foundations along with a lot of other information. In the book, there are chapters on menstrual cycle charting, optimizing your cycle for conception, the pill, and how to organize that to optimize conception, egg and sperm quality, supporting egg and sperm quality. We have an entire chapter on PCOS and hypothalamic amenorrhea. And we talk about topics such as endometriosis and fibroids. It's a really comprehensive book.
Oh, fantastic.
And the nutrition information is really stellar. So we wrote that book, obviously, like I said, for women who are trying to conceive, but I feel that any woman who's concerned about hormonal health will benefit from those tenets. That would be for someone who's really interested and likes what we talked about. The charting is important, but bringing it all together with respect to improving overall cycle health. And I'll also just mention my first book, The Fifth Vital Signs. That book really is heavy on the charting aspect of it. And the reason I wrote that book is to marry the whole cycle charting piece with the concept of the vital sign. 2 really great resources as a place to start for sure. And I'll just share some websites. So realfoodforfertility.com if you want to read the first chapter for free. My website is fertilityfriday.com. If you're on Instagram, I'm at Fertility Friday. So lots of fun stuff happening there too.
No, thank you so much. This has been awesome. Loved having you on, Lisa.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Okay, friend, were you just completely blown away with all the things that Lisa talked about? Oh my goodness. It blew my mind how impactful understanding and knowing our menstrual cycle can be for our overall health. And this isn't just about when we want to have a baby. This is about understanding our cycles, flowing with them, owning our cycles so that we can thrive in the best way that we can, and so that we can recognize the signs that our body is giving us through our menstruation. There is so much to dive into in this episode. I need to go back and re-listen to it. I hope that you gained some really impactful insights to help you work with your menstrual cycle and to help you use your superpowers in each of the different phases, leaning in to time to rest and time to be more productive and time to be creative. and let's help future generations know more about their menstruation than we did when we started menstruating. Thank you, as always, for joining me and being here. If you're ready to create the deeply fulfilling and connecting marriage that you deserve, go to ladiestalkinglove.com/course and make sure to sign up for my course From Pressure to Passion so I can help guide you through creating a deeply connecting and fulfilling sex life with your husband. It is on sale until December 6th, 30% off, and I would love to have you join the course. As always, thanks for talking love.
Thank you to all of you who listen and join me on this journey, and to our Ladies Talking Love team who make the podcast possible. Thanks to our sound wizard, Kimberly Demers,
and our miscellaneous task whiz, Melissa Havertz.